Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to talk about spanking or corporal punishment or physical discipline, whatever term you want to use, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm probably going to primarily refer to it as spanking. I do live in the South. I live in South Carolina, so that's a term that I hear often, as well as, beating, hiding, whipping, things like that. Those are terms that seem to be used to refer to spanking or physical discipline. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to really focus on what the research says. But before we get started, I want to take a minute and introduce myself. Now, this is not me. This is a random picture of my daughter. And as those of you who watch these videos every other week can attest, I always try to put a picture of myself. But I just didn't. I just decided to put this adorable one of my daughter, who is now 15, and she is my co-host on my parenting podcast called One Day You'll Thank Me. But this is a picture of her when she was about 6, and she was in dance class, and she did that for about a year and then decided to move on to something else. But welcome to our free parenting webinar series. We're going to do it the first and third Mondays of every month, and we're going to do it at noon Eastern Standard Time. You can listen live, so thank you for those of you who are here now, or you can get the recording emailed to you at a later time for you to watch at your convenience. My training, I have a doctorate in school psychology. I'm a licensed mental health clinician, and I have a private practice located in Charlotte, North Carolina. I focus on working with parents and kids, and most of the time the kids that I work with are struggling with something behavioral. They might have anxiety, they might have oppositional behavior or refusal behavior, temper tantrums, disrespect towards parents. I have created subspecialties in the work that I do where I work with families who are struggling to teach their kids how to use technology and social media in a really moderate and healthy way. And then I also work with a lot of divorced and separated parents and blended families. And right now, I'm offering a stepmothers group called the Empowered Stepmother, and we're starting it in a couple weeks. And we're going to meet with about between 6 and 8 stepmothers, and we're going to have some different topics to discuss each week. But the goal is to give stepmoms some strategies and some support that they can use to benefit their life as a stepmother. Because as those of you who are stepmothers know, and I am one of them, it can be really challenging sometimes. So that's me. I'm going to introduce and start to talk about spanking. When it comes to disciplining our kids, this is one of the most debated topics among parents. I am involved in a lot of Facebook groups that are for parents. And this comes up, if it doesn't come up every week, it definitely comes up every other week about how to discipline kids. And there seems to be a lot of parents who feel really passionately about not disciplining with physical discipline strategies, and other parents who really feel that it's necessary in order to teach their kids right from wrong. So we're going to talk about the research today so that you can be better informed as a parent when it comes to disciplining your kids. First of all, I want to define spanking. I define spanking, or the literature defines spanking as it's a physical punishment that typically involves hitting a child with an open hand, typically across their buttocks or their bottom. The intent is to cause physical pain or discomfort in order to modify the child's behavior. So spanking is not hitting your child with an object, smacking your kid across the face, things like that. When we talk about spanking, we're talking about hitting a child on their butt with an open hand. So if you as a parent are doing some of the other things I said, using objects, hitting the child in another area of the body, then you are not spanking, and that's not specifically what we're referring to today. But this information would probably still continue to be helpful. Some statistics on spanking. It is most likely to be used by parents who have kids between the ages of 3 and 5 years. We do know that kids are oftentimes spanked younger than that and older than that. Some kids are spanked well into their teen years. Over time, parents are less likely to use spanking to discipline their children. So in 1993, 60% of parents with preschoolers, that 3 to 5 year old range, said that they spanked their child. By 2017, that figure had decreased to 39%. And parents who approve of spanking as a parenting strategy were more likely to be spanked themselves. And I see this mimicked in a lot of the comments that I note on the Facebook pages where they say, I was spanked and I'm fine. And so they use that as justification. Now, in full transparency, I was spanked too. I think it happened pretty rarely. My parents were very young when they had kids. They were married at 19, had their first child at 21, were not college educated. I'm sure they had I never saw a parenting book in their house or anything like that. They did, however, reflecting back, they did very much have a belief that spanking was only to be used as a strategy up till a certain age. And then they said, you're too old to spank, like you have other consequences. So just to attest to those people out there who say, well, I was spanked and I'm fine. And I can tell you I was spanked. And I do think, based on my experience, as well as all my work and working with kids, that there are consequences to it. And being fine, I'm fine. I'm a reputable adult who is a productive person in society, who does not have addictions. And I like to think of myself as a good parent. I think we got to figure out like what fine means and whether or not my version of fine would have been more fine had I not been spanked. I do know that corporal punishment of students is still allowed in schools across 19 states. And I am going to take a minute and just show you the policy that's within my own children's school district. So once again, I live in South Carolina, which is probably not viewed as like the most progressive state when it comes to education or using more research-based parenting practices. And I used a couple arrows here to kind of highlight some of the key parts of this policy that I wanted to point out. So first of all, I wanted to show you that in South Carolina, they still use corporal punishment, and they refer back to 2 U.S. Supreme Court decisions which have affirmed the constitutionality of the use of corporal punishment in the public schools. And what I want to draw your attention to is that these cases are from 1975 and 1977. So we're not talking about recent legislation. We're not talking about cases that were able to benefit from the more current research. So as a parent whose kids attend a public school district in South Carolina, it concerns me that they're making reference back to cases that are just so old and outdated. So for me, that's kind of a silly way to justify that this is appropriate to still have on the books as a policy. Another thing I want to note here is that corporal punishment is permitted only by paddling on the buttocks. So that means that a paddle, an object, would be used, not an open hand. It also says in this that teachers, assistant principals, and principals designees can spank a kid, and it goes up through 12th grade. So I don't know about you, but me as a adult, fully grown woman, striking a 16 or 17-year-old boy, to me just seems like 2 adults hitting each other versus, adult using physical discipline on a child. So not that I think that one is better than the other, but there's no way we would go out into the world as an adult and feel that we could express our disappointment in somebody not following our rules by hitting them. But yet we can do it to a 17-year-old who happens to be a junior or senior in high school. Another thing I want to note here is that the student need not be afforded a formal opportunity to present his side to the professional school employee witnessing the corporal punishment. I think it's interesting that they just refer to his as though it's a boy. The second thing is that they don't have a chance to speak up for themselves and potentially argue their case. Also, trying to see if you need to have parent permission. Doesn't look like it. Sorry, I meant to look at this earlier. It doesn't look like the professional has to get parent permission to spank the child. All it says is that records must be maintained when corporal punishment is used. So the record needs to contain the name of the student, the type of misconduct, any previous disciplinary actions, the type of corporal punishment administered, which that's weird because what I thought the only type that could be administered was paddling on the buttocks. The name of the person administering the punishment, the names of the witnesses present, and then in the date of the punishment. And they have to be able to give the child's parent an explanation for the reasons for corporal punishment, including that information in the discipline record. So I do also want to say that I've been working in the public school district now for almost 25 years, and I've never actually known a real kid to be, to have physical punishment used on them. So I do want to say that. So even though this is in the books, in my, lifetime experience, I have never seen this policy used. So hopefully it's old and dusty and is not being used. I can't even imagine how I'd feel as a parent if my child were hit at school. So now let's talk about some of the research. Let's talk about what spanking does do and what it doesn't do. What spanking does is it does get kids' attention. If you grab a kid and you spank their bottom, it definitely is going to be noticed. Usually it results in an immediate cessation of the behavior. So I'm just going to say a situation at home. If your child is, let's say, coloring on the walls, and you go over and they're coloring on the walls and you pull them and you spank their bottom, like they're going to stop coloring on the walls. And if nothing else, it does interrupt whatever misbehavior they're doing. It causes physical pain. The child is most likely to respond with some sort of fear or confusion or embarrassment. The older the kid is, well, I don't even want to say that because I think younger kids can be very embarrassed when they're spanked, but a 12-year-old being spanked is very humiliating for them. So, there is a purpose behind an adult spanking a child to make them feel bad, to make them either feel physical pain or that emotional pain of being confused or embarrassed. Spanking does role model physical aggression as a problem-solving strategy or as a way of resolving conflict. And usually in the moment, right, if you're with a child and you spank them, they usually get even more distressed. Right now they're crying, maybe they're screaming, maybe they're defending themselves, and it could be verbally or physically. And so spanking a child does not calm down the event in that moment. It just kind of causes everything to get escalated because whatever they were doing that was the misbehavior, and maybe you verbally corrected them, now everything is turned up a notch because we have an adult who is striking a child. So in that moment, we know that there's an increase in distress, but we also know based on research that there's a long-term psychological distress that comes from being spanked. Anxiety, trust issues, sadness. We know that when we look at the data really carefully, we see that kids who are spanked are actually more likely to have behavioral problems as they get older. So we think that that spanking kids increases their likelihood of having behavioral issues. And this might include tantrums, it might include aggression or defiance. And in that moment when a child is spanked, they're not typically thinking like, oh my goodness, I'm so ashamed of myself, I shouldn't have done that. They're usually thinking, oh my goodness, mom or dad was mean to me, or look, I feel badly, or poor me. And they oftentimes go into a space of recognizing like their victimhood versus being able to reflect on their behavior and think, oh goodness, I really made a poor choice. I probably shouldn't do that again. So it's important for parents to realize there just isn't going to be the type of response that you hope to have when you spank your child. We hope that kids are going to stop the behavior, learn something, recognize their poor choices, and choose differently next time. But what we know about spanking is it stops the behavior immediately, but doesn't necessarily lead to kids taking responsibility for their actions or modifying their behavior for next time. We know that kids who spank or who are spanked are less likely to be responsive to non-violent forms of punishment. So I want to tell you an anecdote about this. I often work with parents whose children are sent to daycare, and while they're at daycare, they have been asked to leave, like kicked out of daycare, because that child is demonstrating some sort of misbehavior. So oftentimes it's disrespect towards teachers, it's aggression towards their peers, and the daycare providers feel like the child is not being responsive to their instruction, their attempts to teach the child a more pro-social behavior, or even the consequences that give the child, whether it's, have them sit in timeout or have to give an apology, whatever it is. And sometimes when I start working with these kids, because parents will call me and say, my goodness, my child has been kicked out of 2 daycares now. I need to work. I hate that my kid is hurting other kids. What do I do? And after getting to know the family, I find that the kids who struggle the most at daycare with disrespectful or defiant behavior are kids who are spanked. And the reason that I suspect that this is an issue is because these are kids, first of all, who haven't learned to problem solve with non-aggressive means, but also these are kids who don't necessarily pay attention to cues that they need to stop their misbehavior until they are spanked. So in a daycare setting, the children are not spanked. There's no time in all my years, and I used to work in daycare when I was in college, that daycare providers are going to spank a child. I've never seen it happen. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But the daycares that I work with here in Charlotte, North Carolina, I've never heard of a child being spanked. I have heard of parents coming to the school to spank their child because their child misbehaved, but I've never heard of a daycare provider in a daycare center spanking a child. So what happens is the teacher prompts the child, redirects the child, maybe does that a gentle hand over hand to guide them to make a good decision. Maybe they even scold them. Maybe they give them a consequence. And kids don't even know, they don't even recognize that as being directions that they should attend to, because they're just, what it is at home is they just wait to be spanked. And then that's when they know, okay, I went too far and I need to do something different. So when you have a relationship with your child at home where the primary means that you convey disapproval, is spanking, kids do not attend to less or more mild forms of correction. So they just kind of stay oblivious, and then they know once they're spanked, then I'm going to listen. And so in other environments where they're not going to be spanked, they just don't respond. So that is not always the case, but it is. I see that trend in my work. I also see that spanking can erode the parent-child relationship. And this makes sense. If somebody hits me, I don't trust them. I don't feel safe in their environment. I can feel on edge. And oftentimes spanking is used very inconsistently by parents. So it's like, if the parent is fed up, if they've had a really long day, if they feel like whatever their child did was just kind of a trigger for them, they might spank. But that same behavior on a different day might not warrant a spank. So a lot of times kids are really, really unsure of what results in spanking and what doesn't. And these are not always parents who are willing to listen to kids' sides. So kids can end up feeling a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. No matter what I do, I'm probably going to be hit. And so their investment in the relationship with their parents or being a good communicator just diminishes over time. The kids that I work with, especially teenagers who have a history of being spanked, they just feel like their parents are mean a lot of times. I can't talk to him, or they do a lot of lying to stay out of trouble because they're afraid that when they get in trouble, they're going to be hit. So it can kind of just turn into a cycle of unhealthy communication patterns and relationship between parents and child. What spanking does not do, it does not teach kids what they should be doing instead of what they should not be doing. So if your child, let's just say, is at their dinner table and they keep wiggling around and they're eating in a really gross way, like they're not using their manners, or they keep interrupting, and you say, stop doing that. Stop talking with food in your mouth. And they go back to it a minute later, and then you spank them. You're not necessarily telling them, listen, I need you to sit on your bottom, and I need you to use your fork and spoon, and I need you to stay quiet until everyone else is done talking. A lot of times, spanking is accompanied with the words, don't do this, stop doing that. And so kids may not be able to conceptualize what would be a better choice. We know that spanking does not result in long-term change. So kids will cease their misbehavior in that moment. They may cease behaving that way in front of a certain person, but they don't necessarily internalize what that behavior should be. So later on, we see that kids repeat the misbehavior over and over, and it doesn't result in long-term change. So that kind of is really disheartening, because sometimes people will say, okay, well, spanking, I know that it's harsh. I don't like to be a parent that spanks, but it works. And based on the data that has been, research has occurred for decades over spanking. Like, this isn't new fancy research. This is methodically replicated over time. We don't see that it works. So basically, you're in a situation where you're physically harming your child and causing them fear and pain, and it's not even working in diminishing problematic behavior. Spanking does not role model appropriate self-restraint or emotional regulation. There are times when I have kids that I work with that are very aggressive towards their parents, and when we look a little deeper, we do see aggressive behavior back. And sometimes it's that traditional spanking, open palm on their child's butt, and other times it's grabbing, saying really hateful things, making threats, pushing, just aggressive behavior, chasing their kid if they disobey. And so these are kids who struggle to role model or struggle to incorporate self-restraint in their own behavior because they're not seeing it from a parent. Most of the time, we do not hear of kids speaking about their parents or adults in a respectful way. If they have experienced spanking, they usually present the adult as somebody who they feel is out of control. They'll say, my dad freaked out and he started hitting me, or, they just look at this person as just kind of losing it. And it's really easy for them to justify repeating that behavior themselves if they're seeing a parent do it. We don't see that spanking improves conflict resolution skills, communication skills, or critical thinking skills. It's a very, black and white type of consequence. It does not cultivate conversation. It doesn't cultivate empathy. It doesn't have kids determine that a certain behavior could be more or less appropriate in one environment versus another. And so it just ends up being where there's a lot of missed opportunities to teach your kids to behave better when you resort to spanking so quickly. I just want to remind some people, there's nowhere else in society where we permit people to hit or be hit. So why do we have this double standard when it comes to our children? Kids don't need pain to learn. And most of the time when parents spank, they're doing it because they're frustrated, they're angry, they feel like they're at their wit's end. Parents are not typically spanking because they're like, well, kids are going to benefit from this as a learning strategy, and they're not going into a situation where they're spanking, where they're in a mental space to be teaching their kids. It's usually done in sort of a retaliatory way because their child has angered them or insulted them or been disrespectful or disobeyed them. So in that moment, this isn't an opportunity to have your kid learn. They might be learning that you get angry, or they could be learning that you problem solve this way, but they're probably not going to learn what part of that behavior was a misbehavior or a mistake and what they can be doing next time. Basically, the use of spanking speaks more to parents' lack of ability to discipline than to kids' lack of ability to behave. So what we want to do as parents is focus on what we can be doing to teach our kids to behave versus relying on strategies that are really viewed to be outdated and ineffective. Now, I did want to talk about just a couple alternatives to spanking. And I do want to let you know that we're going to talk more about this next week, which would actually be next time in 2 weeks. I think that would be February 14th, if I have that right, but that's a Monday. Could be the 15th. But I just want to take a couple minutes to mention alternatives to spanking, because I don't want to spend today saying you should never spank and then not give you some ideas of what you can do instead. Ideally, when we interact with our kids, we're going to want to set the stage for them to be successful. We want to create an environment where it's easy for them to behave, and poor behavior isn't as tempting to do. So I'll give an example is, let's say you have a rule that your child is not supposed to be like making a mess with their stuff. Okay. And what we want to do is make sure that the playroom is got age appropriate toys, that there's things that we can do to make it easy for them to put them away, that we don't have our own belongings that might be tempted to touch in there. And we want to set the stage for them to be able to follow the rules as easily as possible. And once they do, if they're showing a behavior that demonstrates that they know the rules, we want to make sure to reinforce that. So many times when kids behave, we don't say anything. But when they misbehave, we're kind of all over them. We're fussing at them. We're giving them immediate criticism or corrective feedback. But we forget to say, gosh, I really appreciate how you cleaned up half your toys when I stepped away to take that phone call. Why don't you go ahead and clean up the other half, because you did such a great job on the first half. Instead, we come back and we're like, why aren't these toys cleaned up? You know the rule. If you're done playing with the toys, you put them away. So we have to make sure that we're letting kids know when they're behaving in a positive way so that they're going to be motivated to keep doing it. The good choice is right there. It's clearly defined. They get appreciation and acknowledgement for it, because most of the time kids want to please their parents. They want to please the adults in their life. And we have to make it very, very clear what is pro-social behavior or behavior that we support and appreciate and want to encourage, instead of just focusing on the times that they do something wrong. And I know I've been there as a parent. I'm like, oh, the kids are playing so nice. Like, I don't even want to poke the bear. And so I don't say anything. And then when they start squabbling with each other, all of a sudden now I'm annoying. It's really important to let kids know, like, gosh, you guys are doing such a great job playing that game. I really appreciate you playing quietly while I get my work done. Thank you so much. Also, kids can benefit from getting reinforced by having them get something boring or hard or something they don't like taken away when they've done a good job. So I have an example here. Because you did such a great job babysitting your sister while mom was on the phone, you don't have to set the table at night or tonight. So because they did such a great job doing one thing, they got out of doing something that is unpleasant. So telling kids or reinforcing kids or using rewards when they do a good job is great. But also a way to reward a child is to take away something negative. So teachers do this when kids, like, if you get an A on your test, you don't have to do tonight's homework. So the reward is taking away something negative. So that can be a really effective way to support your child's good behavior. A couple other things here is non-aggressive forms of punishment. Timeout, which is just removing them from the environment that they're in. Maybe they misbehaved while playing with their friend, and you say you have to be in timeout, and you're removing them from that environment temporarily so they can kind of hit the reset button. You can have a loss of privileges, removing a privilege after they misbehave. So, and a lot of times parents might say, you don't have a privilege to go on a play date because you behaved so poorly in the store today when we were trying to go shopping. You don't have the privilege of using your video game system tonight because you have so many zeros in your homework, in your grade book. They might lose preferred items. So let's say your kid misbehaves at a restaurant and they're acting with poor manners and they're loud. You might say, okay, we're going to leave and we're not going to have dessert tonight. And that's a preferred item, and they didn't have the opportunity to have it because they made some poor choices. So there's things like that you can do. And these are more things that we see happen in school and daycares and things like that. And they can be very effective if they're used consistently, used with compassion, and kids also have the instruction that they need to learn what the positive behavior is that they should be doing instead. And now I just wanted to kind of recognize that there's a lot of people who think how I discipline my kids is none of your business. Like, who are you, Tara, to suggest that what I'm doing isn't right? Well, first of all, the risks of physical discipline are known. This is not a secret. The information is available, and it's important for members of the community, such as myself, whether you're a therapist or you're an educator, that you make sure that parents have access to updated information about physical discipline. So the risks are well established by decades of research. And if I, as a child therapist, if I'm not going to take on the responsibility of advocating for children by educating parents, then who is? Like, I am the right person to give some parents some guidance about how they can better support their kids in having positive behavior. So yeah, I'm not going to be in your home. There's definitely some physical discipline that is legal, you're not committing a crime or anything like that. But I really think it's important for parents to understand, like, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean it's going to be effective. And parents come to me often and they call me up and they say, gosh, I'm having such a hard time with my kid. That's why I'm reaching out to you. And they'll tell me that they've used spanking to discipline their child. And I really want to reinforce with parents or anybody who's listening, but I have no interest in shaming parents who've used physical discipline to discipline their kids. My goal is to have parents have other tools in the toolbox, tools that are effective and aren't going to impair their relationship with their child. And if I can impart that information and I can support those parents in trying new things and I can support that child in being responsive to other modes of discipline, then that's my job and that's what I want to do. So it's not about making parents feel bad if they've made that choice in the past. It's about making sure they know what they can do moving forward. Okay, so I just want to state that. Let's see here. Our next topic, as I mentioned, is we're going to take a more in-depth look at reinforcement and punishment and give some more examples, really explain what these two concepts are, because I wanted to follow our spanking discussion today with a much more in-depth look at some alternates that we can use and really understanding how kids learn from their mistakes and what we can do to encourage positive behavior. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening today. If you listen to this presentation and you have any questions, please shoot me an email. You can do that at drterryegan@gmail.com. Or if you are a client who works with me through Charlotte Parent Coaching, you have my email, tara.egan@charlotteparentcoaching.com. And I just want to remind you that I do offer one-to-one coaching services with families who are struggling with their kids' behavior. And if you'd like to know more about that, please visit my website at www.drterryegan.com. And if you click on the one-to-one coaching tab, you'll see what the scheduling could look like and what pricing can look like, because I'd really like to support parents out there in any way I can. And then lastly, here's my contact information. I've got a couple different websites depending on the services that I offer. Here's an email address, here's my phone number, and then I just want to remind you to tune in to the One Day You'll Thank Me Parenting podcast. We have new episodes every Wednesday, and you can find our podcast on any of the podcasting platforms that you prefer. I love Apple Podcasts. I know my brother listens to Stitcher, but there's a lot of really great ones out there. So please tune in. And if you like what you hear or you have a question, please leave us a review. So I hope everyone out there has a great Monday. Thank you so much for being part of this presentation today. And I look forward to seeing you soon.